Hello everybody and welcome back to a new video. My name is Sarah and today we are going to be doing my October wrap-up. Now, somehow October was a phenomenal reading month in terms of quantity of books and quality of books. I kind of know how. I ended up reading 11 books this month, which is a record-breaking number for me. Normally I read on average anywhere between 5 to 7. There's been a couple months that I've read 8 books, but I've never read anywhere near 11 books. Now that being said, most of these books, if not all of them, are much shorter than what I typically read lengthwise on average per month, which is why I was able to read so many. So in reality, the page number is probably the same, maybe a little bit more, because I was just like on a bit of a binge reading. Almost all of these books I was just super satisfied with, or just completely blown away. So without further ado, since we have 11, I'm gonna get right into it, and hopefully I'll be able to kind of rocket my way through some of these, because 11 is a lot for me to get through. So the first book that I read in October was The Silent Companions by Laura Purcell. This is my first Laura Purcell book that I have read, and I've been very excited to check her out as an author. This is a historical horror novel. We're set in the 1800s, and we're following our main character who has recently been widowed, and she is pregnant and she's moving out to her recently deceased husband's estate. He kind of has this mansion that's kind of out in the middle of nowhere, and she's moving there to live there and kind of take care of her husband's assets. While there, she quickly finds this little like wooden cutout doll thing. Think of like a cardboard cutout almost, but make it antique, and it suspiciously looks like what she imagines her child to look like, and then really weird things start happening with this cardboard cutout, and it just kind of spirals out from there. And I had a lot of fun with this book. I definitely am super excited to check out more of Laura Purcell's works. I'm actually currently reading The Shape of Darkness. I'm not too terribly far into it. I just started it, but I'm loving her writing style. Was great. The book is very atmospheric. The characters are also really interesting. The main character isn't entirely likable, yet you're still rooting for her. I also found the pacing to be really good. It was just one of those books that I couldn't put down. I didn't want to stop reading it. At some point, we also diverge into 2 timelines, and you know, sometimes when you have dual timelines in a book, you typically have one timeline that you prefer to read from, that you find more interesting. That was not the case in this book. I found both timelines equally engaging, and like I was super excited to keep moving forward and find out more with both timelines. I also was totally shocked by this book. You know, the ending happens, and then the very last sentence had me actually look up from the book and kind of just be like, what? By the very last sentence. So that was a lot of fun, and I did end up giving this 4 stars. So then the next book that I read was You Let Me In by Camilla Bruce. This is more of a, I guess, speculative horror, or kind of like a fantasy leaning horror. So in this book we're following our main character, Cassandra Tipp. She is a very famous romance author, and now she's an elderly woman kind of in retirement days, and she has disappeared and is presumed to be dead. Now her life, she has 2 kind of big, I guess, dark spots on her life. She went up for trial for her husband's disembowelment, yet she was acquitted on the insanity plea. And then later in her life there was a murder-suicide involving her father and brother, and somehow people still think that she was entangled in that. She's disappeared, and we are a year later and she's presumed dead. And so her niece and nephew have been granted her estate and her will, yet going there they find a manuscript on her desk, and it says says that in order for them to actually get to the keys to the estate and full access to her will, they need to read this manuscript that kind of tells what actually happened during some of those darker spots in her life. So basically, this book is the manuscript, and the manuscript starts actually from when Cassandra was a child and then moves all the way up through her entire life. This book blew me away. First of all, Camilla Burris's writing style is haunting. It is gorgeous, but it is absolutely haunting. This is one of those books where you are following things happening and you're following two different perceptions of what is happening, like an explanation behind things. And most of the time with those types of books, you're able to kind of figure out which one is like true reality, I guess. Is there really a true reality? But in this book, I felt like things were tackled in a very unique perspective when it comes to trying to determine which of the perceptions is the real one or whatever. And I just was totally floored by this, really, really impressed. It is eerie, it is unsettling, but it is horrifying in a very sad way. Lots and lots of trigger warnings. If you have any sort of trauma in your life, I would definitely look up the trigger warnings to this because there is a whole host of trauma in this book. But I can't really go into more detail of what this book really tackles and like what it's truly about without spoiling a lot of the things that I really enjoyed getting to discover and that I found really impressive with how they were revealed. But I was just absolutely blown away. The only reason this didn't get 5 stars and it got 4.5 instead is because everything was so tightly and impressively interwoven within each other, except for when it came to kind of the brother's story and when she had to reach kind of her point of telling what happened with her brother and father's murder-suicide. It was still really believable and really well done, but it felt a bit looser than the rest of everything else. And I just wish it felt just as watertight as the rest of the novel, and so because of that it got 4.5 stars. So after that I read Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke and Other Misfortunes by Eric LaRocca. So this is a bind-up of Eric LaRocca's kind of internet famous novella Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke, along with a never before published novella The Enchantment and a short story. You'll find it's like that all over. Now I'm gonna run through each of these just real quick, and because they are so short, I'm just going to give the little blurb for each of them on the inside cover in order to not spoil anything. So, Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke is a whirlpool of darkness churns at the heart of a macabre ballet between two lonely young women in an internet chat room in the early 2000s. A darkness that threatens to forever transform them once they finally succumb to their most horrific desires. So that novella, I can 100% see why it took off so much among like the internet community and everything like that. That was the most disturbing and disgusting horror story I have ever read. I was very, very uncomfortable, and not the good kind of uncomfortable, throughout the entirety of reading that novella. Now, that being said, I know the whole point of a horror story is to make you, as the reader, uncomfortable. That's the whole point. But there's a difference between like an uncomfortable that you like enjoy feeling, I guess, that you go into it like that's why you read it, and then there's like the type of uncomfortable that you don't enjoy, that's not fun. And that was this first novella. It was not for me. Because of that, I did not rate this entire collection. But yeah, didn't like it, but like I can see why people like it, because it is a very well written novella. It's very well done. And I was impressed with how it was put together. Not my cup of tea. It was too much for me. Now, The Enchantment, on the other hand, that's about a couple isolates themselves on a remote island in an attempt to recover from their teenage son's death when a mysterious young man knocks on their door during a storm. Now, that novella, on the other hand, tackled concepts and like the type of horror that I do really enjoy and I do find really interesting. I really liked kind of the ideas and the themes that were coming together in this novella. However, I felt like that, like, in order to really marinate on these topics and really bring them to their full potential, I really think that this novella needed to be a full-length novel. There was not enough time spent on kind of all of the different aspects of the story that he was pulling together, and I really wish that it was a full-length book. And then the short story is called You'll Find It's Like That All Over. It's only about 30 pages, and it is about a man confronting his neighbor when he discovers a strange object in his backyard, only to be drawn into an ever more dangerous game. Now, that short story, I just don't like short story horror. It doesn't work for me. I like to really like dive in and, like I said, marinate in the horror and the concepts that are going on. And because of that, like, it was interesting what LaRocca was trying to do, but it just didn't really impact me a whole lot, didn't really do anything for me. But I do think, like, objectively, it was an okay short story. It wasn't horrible, it wasn't bad, it was well written, and the concept was really interesting. But yeah, like I said, I did not read this because I had such strong conflicting emotions about the first novella. So after that, I definitely wanted to keep with like the spooky theme, but I needed something more light, I guess. And so I went with Vespertine by Margaret Rogerson. This is a YA fantasy that still keeps with the spooky season. So I actually am going to read the inside cover of this because when I tried to describe this book in a vlog, I felt like I did a really bad job of explaining what it actually is about. So I am just going to read the inside. The dead of Laurel do not rest. Artemisia is training to be a Grey Sister, a nun who cleanses the bodies of the deceased so that their souls can pass on. Otherwise, they will rise as spirits with a ravenous hunger for the living. She would rather deal with the dead than the living, who trade whispers about her scarred hands and troubled past. When her convent is attacked by possessed soldiers, Artemisia defends it by awakening an ancient spirit bound to a saint's relic. It is a remnant, a malevolent being that threatens to possess her the moment she drops her guard. Wielding its extraordinary power almost consumes her, but death has come to Laurel, and only a Vespertine, a priestess trained to wield a high relic, has any chance of stopping it. With all knowledge of Vespertine's lost to time, Artemisia turns to the last remaining expert for help, the remnant itself. As she unravels a sinister mystery of saints, secrets, and dark magic, her bond with the Revenant grows. And when a hidden evil begins to surface, she discovers that facing this enemy might require her to betray everything she has been taught to believe, if the Revenant doesn't betray her first. This was exactly what I was looking for when I picked this up. You know, I've said it before with Rogerson's other works that she has a very unique style of writing her stories where they feel like traditional kind of classic fairy tales, but they're very new stories. You know, they're not traditional classic fairy tales. They're not retellings or anything. They just feel like they should be, which gives this kind of like cozy feeling to the story. Very, very adventurous. I think her stories keep getting more and more adventurous, from An Enchantment of Ravens being kind of a quieter story to A Sorcerer of Thorns starting to have some like sword fights and battles, and this one has full-on battles with armies involved. What's interesting is this book doesn't have any romance involved, which is new for Rogerson compared to her previous two novels, but I think it worked really well for this book. We really focus on Artemisia as a character, and the lack of romance just fits with her character very well. And not saying that like romance is even needed to begin with, but I think it just worked really well for this story and wasn't needed at all. I think Artemisia is a very interesting character. I know a lot of people say that she's kind of bland, but I don't think so. I think she has some like nuance to her, but she's supposed to feel kind of like flat and bland because that's just how she interacts with other characters, because she doesn't know how to interact with other people, if that makes sense. But then I also really enjoyed her relationship with the Revenant. We've got another very sassy, kind of questionably evil entity on our hands in this book, and it was just a lot of fun. Like I said, very adventurous, very fun, very spooky and atmospheric. You have this kind of like a feeling of everything being kind of wrapped up in fog throughout a lot of this book, and I think it was done really well. And yeah, I really enjoyed it, and like I said, it was exactly what I needed, and I gave it 4 stars. So then after that, I read Sundial by Catriona Ward. This is another horror novel, and this was one of the books that I found to be disappointing. Not that it was bad, it wasn't a bad book, it just didn't reach the expectations that I had for it. So in this book, we're following kind of a family of 4, a mom, a dad, and their 2 daughters, but we're mostly focusing on the mother, Rob, and her eldest daughter, Callie. So Callie is like 11, and she's starting to do some very strange, unsettling, questionably serial killer activities. And because of that, Rob has decided that she needs to get Callie out of their house and take her back to her homestead, I guess, in the middle of the desert, where some very strange things happened to Rob as a child, and she thinks that those things that happened to her are the reason why Callie is acting so weird and sinister. And then we also get chapters from Callie's perspective, where Callie is starting to think that there's something wrong with her mom, and she is getting increasingly scared and uncomfortable with the I guess, evolving situation. And so a lot of this book is actually Rob kind of uncovering the past and relaying to Callie kind of her childhood and what all happened in this kind of homestead ranch in the middle of the desert, and linking it back to why Callie is starting to act the way that she is and how can they fix it. I was entertained with this book. Like I said, it wasn't bad, but I felt almost a sense of removal from the story, because there was like lots of like kind of big reveals and kind of twists and things happening, and I either saw them coming from a mile away and they were super obvious, or they just happened and I was like, oh, that's interesting, and like I had no real like feelings about it, I guess. Like, I found the characters interesting. I found the story not 100% unique, but like interesting and fresh feeling at the same time. Just with how they took different aspects that I've seen before and meshed them all together. But yeah, I just felt like some of the reveals were super, super obvious and not to the point where it worked in the story's favor. And then other reveals just felt really, really flat, and just didn't work for me at all. But overall, I really don't think that this is a bad book. And like I said, I was entertained while reading it. You know, it did its job in entertaining me. It just didn't wow me or, you know, surprise me or evoke a lot of emotion in me like I was wanting it to, and because of that I gave it 3 stars. And while kind of reading these other books, I was listening to the audiobook The Girls Are Also Nice Here by Laurie Elizabeth Flynn. So this is a thriller novel, and it's kind of like those rich, snobby schoolgirl thrillers, I guess. I realized while listening to this that I had completely forgotten about one of my guilty pleasures that I had growing up, which was reading those books or book series that are about like a group of girls in a private school and all of the drama that goes on with them. So think like Pretty Little Liars, that series. I've never watched the show, but I read the first 10 books. And then think there was another book series that I read in middle school, and it was called like Click or something. I'll put a picture up here. But that was like the rich mean girl drama that for whatever reason it was like a guilty pleasure of mine, and I loved reading about it because it was the complete opposite of my life. And so then The Girls Are Also Nice Here is basically the adult version of that. So we're following our main character who gets this invitation to her 10-year college college reunion, and she doesn't want to go at all, but it's very clear by some of the subsequent invitations and notices that she gets that somebody really, really wants her there because she was one of the mean girls back in her college days, and her and another girl did something bad, something happened, and they thought that they got away with it, but in these invitations to the reunion, it's very clear that somebody knows what they did and wants her to answer for it finally. And so we're basically going back and forth between two different timelines, or present day, where she is going to the reunion and trying to figure out who knows what she did, who's kind of giving her these sinister messages, and then we're flashing back 10 plus years in the past when she's a freshman at college, leading up to the big event that occurred that she thought that she covered up. Honestly, there was nothing too special about this book. It's kind of, I feel like it's going to be one of those forgettable books. But it was like entertaining, and it was one of those guilty pleasure reads at the time. It is very fast paced, it's very interesting, it's fun to read. There are a couple of different twists. Did I see who is kind of like the person that she's trying to figure out who's contacting her coming? I kind of saw it coming, but it was like satisfying to have it happen. I wasn't 100% sure if that was the person, but I liked who it ended up being. And yeah, I don't have a lot to say about this, but it was just entertaining for what it was, and I did give it 3 stars. So after that, I read Fortune Favors the Dead by Stephen Spotswood. This is the first book in the Pentecost and Parker mystery series. So this is a murder mystery, and I feel like I'm not going to really do it justice explaining it, so I'm just going to read the back. It says, when Scrappy Circus runaway Willow Jean, or Will, Parker saves the day of New York's best and most unorthodox private investigator Lillian Pentecost, she doesn't expect to be offered a life-changing position. Lillian's multiple sclerosis means she can't keep up with her old caseload alone, so she wants to hire Will as her right-hand woman. 3 years later, in 1945, Will and Lillian are called in on the case of Abigail Collins, whose dead body has just been found slumped in the same chair where her steel magnate husband shot himself the year before. With rumors flying that Abigail was bumped off by the vengeful spirit of her husband, the family has tasked the detectives with finding answers. But that's easier said than done in a case involving messages from the dead, a seductive spiritualist, and the deceased's beautiful daughter, Becca Collins. But when Will and Becca's relationship dances beyond the professional, Will finds herself in dangerous territory and discovers she may have become the murderer's next target. I liked this a lot. This was a lot of fun. This is exactly what I wanted in a murder mystery. It has a very noir vibe to it all throughout the book. And Will and Lillian's relationship and kind of like their dynamic is so interesting and fun to read from, because they are both very headstrong women, and you've got kind of like the hardened, almost jaded mentor and the kind of scrappy, kind of spunky mentee up-and-coming detective dynamic going on, and it worked really, really well for both of these characters. And then you've also got the more soft, tender moments of Lillian, really looking out for Will and trying to help her, and vice versa, with Lillian's multiple sclerosis and when she has bad days on those, and Will looking out for her. The murder mystery was very complicated. There was a lot of like threads that all had to come together to weave the final portrait and reveal, and I found that it was really, really well done. I was impressed and really enjoyed it, and like with all of these different threads that all had to come together, I had a very, very vague notion of like where things were going, but I never had a very solid grip on it until it all came together at the very end, and I really liked it. It was just, it was a really interesting, really fun murder mystery, and it's a series that I definitely want to continue, and I did give this 4 stars. And then next, for my nonfiction read for this month, I read Dark Archives by Megan Rosenblum. This is a librarian's investigation into the science and history of books bound in human skin. This was gifted to me by Em over at Ghost Reads. I will link her channel down below, and thank you again so much, Em. This was one of the most fascinating things I have ever read in terms of like nonfiction. I was absolutely enthralled by this, and I highly suggest, if you want like a topic that has the weird intersection of science and history, and it's just one of those like oddball topics, those weird topics, definitely pick this up. The amount of like topics and like things going on in history that kind of all link themselves back up to these books bound in human skin was so fascinating. It also really like talked about how there's a huge misconception behind books bound in human skin, and like the types of books that are bound in them, the types of people that did the binding. It's all very fascinating. So there's also the discussion of how like race comes into play with some of these books, how social status, class, gender, things like that all kind of come into who did the binding and whose skin was being bound. It's just super fascinating, and I highly recommend picking this up. Like I said, if you want just a weird little nonfiction book. So then after that, I read This Thing Between Us by Gus Moreno, and this is another horror novel, and it was another that like blew me away and I was super fascinated and enthralled with. This one genuinely had me creeped out at times and like kind of scared and unsettled, and I kind of had to like look behind me when I was reading. So in this book, we're following a main character who is kind of writing these letters, or like basically talking to his recently deceased wife. There was a big accident that happened that then resulted in her death, and he is just kind of like talking to his wife, and so you as the reader are kind of like the wife, I guess. And so he's telling his wife about kind of her funeral and the immediate events after that, and kind of how he's processing losing her, but then he's also telling her, he's recounting events that they lived together back when they first bought this condo that they lived in, and he's talking about how they experienced weird things like cold spots, or hearing things like little scratches in the walls, and then also how they had this thing that's kind of like an Alexa with Amazon, and how it would severely malfunction at points. But then he is talking about how, with how much he's grieving and how hard of a time he's having with losing his wife, he decides to move out into this cabin in the middle of nowhere in Colorado. And he's hoping that all of these strange occurrences in the condo, like, he leaves them there. But it's very clear that something is following him, and something has followed him to this cabin out in the middle of the Colorado mountains. And this book just tackles a lot of different topics. Obviously it tackles grief, and the way that the grief was described in this book, it was utterly heartbreaking to read at times, and it was so well explored and well done. There's also discussions of media, because the media gets a hold of his wife's death and tries to politicize it. There's like the idea of like technology, surveillance, privacy. All of those types of things are discussed in this book, and then it just takes some really weird turns, and I just really liked the idea of like haunted house elements, but add in like a malfunctioning Alexa. I think it worked really well. It was super creepy. Like I said, really wacky things start happening, and I was super impressed with this. The only reason why I didn't give this 5 stars, and I gave this one 4.5, was because towards the end I got a little lost at like certain points. Like, it almost, things became too convoluted and too out there that I didn't quite know where the author was going with things or what exactly was happening. And so he kind of started to lose me a little bit there. I still think the ending was really good and it fit the book really well. But yeah, he kind of lost me a little bit. So I did end up giving it 4.5 stars. And then after that, I read the novella Nothing But Blackened Teeth by Cassandra Khaw. This is a very, very tiny book. Obviously, it's a novella, like I said. So we're basically following these 5 friends that get access to this rundown historical mansion that is said to be haunted. And they are like these big thrill-seeking friends that do this kind of stuff all the time. But they got access to this mansion in order to have 2 of the friends elope there. And while there, so it's said to be haunted by a bride that was buried within the walls of the house in order to await her husband who never showed up on their wedding day. Things start happening in this house. It's very, very short. And my biggest thing is this needed to be longer. This needed to be a full-length novel because I think, so the 5 friends, it's very clear right from the beginning that there is a lot of complicated emotions amongst these friends. The relationships are toxic at times, very unhealthy, but there's just a lot of history behind them. And I think in order to really have capitalized on that, we really needed to show a lot more of their relationships together and get a better foundation for that in order for some of the subsequent events to happen to really hit home even harder. With that, like taking more time to explore their relationships. We could have taken more time to give like a eerie foreboding sense in the house, because there's a couple of things that like happen that are like eerie or like hints for what's to come before like the big scenes really start kicking off, but there's just not enough time to really marinate in that. And so I think that would have helped this out so much. But that being said, it's fun. It's a fun little horror novel. I think it was so campy. It was self-aware, and because of that, like, I was entertained and I really enjoyed it, actually, for what it was. I just really think that it needed to be a lot longer. But I think if you don't like self-aware or campy horror stories, I don't think you'll like this, because that does play a big part in this, but I did think it was creepy at times, and I liked some of the elements that were involved in like the creepier scenes, but I did end up giving this 3 stars. And then lastly, I read Follow Me to Ground by Sue Rainsford. This is, I don't know if I'd consider this horror, but it's a rather unsettling fantasy book. So this is another one where I'm actually going to read the inside cover because, to be honest, this doesn't have a very solid plot to it. Anna and her father, touched by the power to heal illness, live on the edge of where they help sick locals, or cures, by cracking open their damaged bodies or temporarily burying them in the reviving, dangerous ground nearby. Ada, a being both more and less than human, is mostly uninterested in the cures until she meets a man named Samson. When they strike up an affair, to the displeasure of her father and Samson's widowed pregnant sister, Ada is torn between her old way of life and new possibilities with her lover, and eventually comes to a decision that will forever change Samson, the town, and the ground itself. I overall was kind of disappointed in this book. The writing, gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. I did really enjoy that. And I found it kind of like very unsettling and creepy, just the way that things were described and the focus on the human body and like how it was described in kind of more grotesque ways was very, very interesting and definitely did a lot for this story. I didn't like how meandering the plot was. It just didn't work for me in this one. Sometimes that works for me, but in this book it didn't. There just didn't seem to be a lot going on. It's very, very, very slow considering how short it is. I felt like kind of the reveal, one of the reveals that happened was, again, super obvious. Now, whether or not it was supposed to be that way, I couldn't quite tell, because there's a moment where one of the characters gets it spelled out for them what's happening, and I'm just like, I feel like that was very strongly hinted at, to the point where it was heavy-handed. And so I couldn't tell if it was like you as the reader were supposed to know that, and it was meant for you to know it, and it was just supposed to be a surprise for the character, or if it was supposed to be a surprise for you, the character and the reader. Sometimes you can tell, but in this one I couldn't. But I definitely think I was just kind of bored with this, despite the very interesting and gorgeous writing style. It just didn't hold my attention very well, but I don't think it was a bad book. Again, this is kind of similar to Sundial, where it's not bad, and I did have aspects of it that I did really, really love. So I didn't want to give it less than 3 stars. I didn't think it deserved like a 2 and a 2 or a 2.5, because I thought that there were aspects that were really interesting, but I did end up giving it just a 3 star. So these books, on top of The Silent Companions, The Girls Are Also Nice Here, and This Thing Between Us, are the books that I read in the month of October. If you have read any of these, or if you're looking to read any of these now, please let me know down in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. But thank you so much for sticking around and watching this video. Hopefully it wasn't too terribly long, but I really appreciate you stopping by my channel. I hope you consider sticking around and subscribing if you haven't already. But as always, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!